It is the spring of 2003. I am 22 years old, standing inside St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City for the first time, as part of a press fellowship from my journalism program at Indiana University. The group is moving slowly behind a guide who is explaining the papal altar, the bronze baldachin, the columns, the specific history of who commissioned what and when. I am not listening. I have a habit I picked up from a colleague who was studying architectural history, the habit of reading buildings the way a careful reader reads text, looking at proportions, at the placement of focal points, at the relationship between the entrance and the end of the space, the way a building communicates what it expects you to feel. And something about this building is off, not in a disrespectful way, not the wrong kind of off, just structurally unexpected. The nave is too long for worship. In a building designed for encounter with the divine, you want the worshipper to feel drawn inward, held close to the sacred center. The proportions here do the opposite. They create a long processional corridor, a formal approach, with authority positioned at the far end and the petitioner walking toward it. The apse, the semicircular termination at the altar end, is positioned exactly where a magistrate's bench would sit in a Roman civic building. The raised platform at the altar, the distance that accumulates as you walk toward it. I stopped in the middle of the floor and waited for a gap in the group traffic and turned to the guide. I asked, "Is this building based on a basilica floor plan?" She said, "Yes, of course, it is a basilica." I said, "As in the Roman courthouse?" She paused for just a moment. "It is a long tradition," she said. She moved on. I walked the rest of the tour, watching the ceiling. The building did not feel like a place of encounter. It felt like a place of judgment. And the feeling was not accidental. Someone designed it to feel exactly like that. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I want to stay in that building for another few minutes. Because the floor plan is not incidental. It is the argument. The word basilica comes from basilike stoa, royal hall. In Greco-Roman civic life, the basilica was the courthouse, the administrative building where legal disputes were resolved, contracts witnessed, imperial edicts announced, and justice dispensed under the authority of the Roman state. The magistrate sat at the raised platform at the far end. Citizens came before him as petitioners. The architectural vocabulary, nave, apse, transept, tribunal platform. This is Roman civil engineering, not Galilean spiritual tradition. It was designed for a specific kind of relationship between authority and the people standing before it. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE gave Christians the legal right to practice their faith openly. And when Constantine made good on that edict by providing Christians with physical spaces for communal worship, he did not commission sacred architecture purpose-built for encounter with a Galilean rabbi's teachings. He gave them surplus courthouses, decommissioned administrative buildings, the Lateran Basilica, not St. Peter's, not the building on the tourist maps, but the actual canonical cathedral of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope's seat, the Mater Ecclesiae, was built on the site of the barracks of the Equites Singularis, the Imperial Cavalry Regiment. The Pope's Cathedral is a repurposed military installation on the floor plan of a Roman courthouse. That is not a polemical claim. That is the architectural and historical record. The high ceilings that make you feel small. The long walk from the entrance to the focal point of authority. The raised platform at the altar end, where the magistrate once sat. Every Catholic church in the world follows that floor plan. The building that claims to speak for a man who prayed on hillsides and taught in open fields, who had no fixed address, no office, no formal title, no staff. That building is a repurposed imperial courtroom. Someone decided that was the right container. And the decision was made in the 4th century, 300 years after Jesus walked in Galilee. You have been inside this building hundreds of times. You know the smell. Old stone, wax, incense that has soaked into the walls over decades, a residue of every service ever held there. Something that is not quite cold and not quite warm, the specific temperature of stone that never fully adjusts to the season. You know which pew makes the sound when you sit down. You know where the afternoon light comes through in winter and how it falls across the floor in a particular way. You know the stained glass. You have been reading it since you were young enough to need someone to explain the stories. You never asked who designed the proportions. You never asked why the ceilings are so high that you feel small standing beneath them, or why the altar is so far from the entrance, or why the focal point of authority is elevated and distant rather than level and close. You assumed it was sacred architecture, that someone had designed it to feel exactly the way it feels, to produce that specific combination of awe and smallness and distance. You were right. You just had the wrong institution in mind. The feeling was designed. The proportions were calculated. The distance between the entrance and the altar was not an accident of sacred inspiration. It was a courthouse specification, adapted without apology into the architecture of Christian worship, because the people doing the adapting understood something important. People who feel small in the presence of architecture feel small in the presence of whoever controls the architecture. That is what a basilica does. It was doing it 500 years before Jesus. It is still doing it now. You felt it every time you walked through those doors. You were right to feel it. You just weren't told whose design you were feeling. Here is the number that changed how I read all of this. Not the architecture. The architecture came later. This started with 2 numbers in a notebook. I was 23. First year of graduate work at the University of Southern Indiana, working on a paper about early church formation, how a movement of itinerant Jewish teachers became a hierarchical institution with bishops and deacons and a fixed organizational structure in under 3 centuries. It is a standard question for a historian of religion. I needed to understand the vocabulary. Specifically, I needed to know how often Jesus himself used the Greek word ekklesia, the word translated as church, in every major English Bible. Ekklesia, in its original Greek context, was not a religious term. It was a civic one. It meant assembly, specifically the assembly of free citizens called together to conduct public business, a political gathering, secular, organizational, administrative. I went to a New Testament concordance, standard reference tool, nothing unusual, the kind of thing that sits on the shelf of any divinity school library. I looked up ekklesia. I went through every occurrence in the canonical Gospels. I wrote 2 numbers side by side in my notebook, Jesus 3, Paul 62. I sat with those numbers for a while, then I got up and made tea. I came back and sat down. They were still there. I checked the concordance again, more carefully this time. Went through each Gospel individually. Mark, 0 occurrences of ekklesia in Jesus' speech. Luke, 0. John, 0. Matthew, 3. All 3 in Matthew. 1 in chapter 16. 2 in chapter 18. Then I went through Paul, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Colossians, the pastoral letters, every letter attributed to Paul in the canonical tradition. 62 uses of ekklesia in a single apostle's letters. Verses 3 in the recorded speech of Jesus, all in a single gospel. I wrote 1 question in the margin of my notebook. I did not answer it for 2 years. The question was, who built this? Let me show you where the 2 numbers become a single sentence. The sentence the entire papacy rests on is in Matthew chapter 16 verse 18. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Every claim the Catholic Church makes to hierarchical authority, the primacy of the Bishop of Rome over all other bishops, the apostolic succession that runs from Peter to every subsequent pope, the doctrinal authority of Rome over more than 1 billion people. Every single piece of that structure rests on that 1 sentence. Now here is the textual fact that every serious New Testament scholar acknowledges. Mark is the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels. The mainstream scholarly consensus, not fringe, not controversial, accepted by Catholic and Protestant and secular scholars alike, places Mark's composition at roughly 30 to 40 years after the crucifixion, before Matthew, before Luke, before John. Matthew 16 verse 18 does not appear in Mark. It does not appear in Luke. It does not appear in John. Think about that for a second. 3 of the 4 canonical evangelists, 3 writers with access to the oral and written traditions circulating about Jesus, 3 writers committed enough to those traditions to produce full accounts of his life and teachings. 3 of them wrote their Gospels, without including the single most significant institutional declaration Jesus ever supposedly made, the founding charter of the papacy, the sentence from which 2,000 years of hierarchical authority descend. 3 of 4 evangelists who knew the tradition well enough to produce full gospel accounts chose not to record it. Matthew was not writing in isolation. He had access to Mark. Scholars have established that Matthew used Mark as a source, incorporating whole sections verbatim into his own account. And then he added something Mark did not have: the one sentence that created the papacy. Read the silence. 3 evangelists, 3 full accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus, 0 uses of Matthew 16 verse 18. That is not a theological argument. That is a documentary record. And the question the documentary record is asking, the question it has been asking for 2,000 years, is whether that sentence is a biographical report of something Jesus said, or an institutional document produced by people who needed a founding authorization that they did not yet have. Now let me show you the sequence that made me set my notebook down and walk around the block. The institutional vocabulary of Christianity, bishop, deacon, elder, presbyter, does not come from Jesus. Not one of those titles appears in Jesus' recorded speech, not in Mark, not in Luke, not in John, not in Matthew. The titles come from Paul. Episkopos, bishop, appears in Paul's letter to the Philippians. Diakonos, deacon, appears across Paul's letters. Presbyteros, elder presbyter, from which the English word priest derives. Paul writes this into community governance in the pastoral letters. Paul established the governance vocabulary of institutional Christianity. And Paul, by his own explicit account, never met Jesus during his lifetime. Paul was a persecutor of the early followers of Jesus. He was present at the stoning of Stephen. He was en route to Damascus to arrest members of the movement when he had the experience that reversed his direction. He received his theology, as he describes it in Galatians, not from the disciples who had known Jesus, but from what he calls a revelation. He never heard Jesus teach. He never sat at a meal with him. He never received direct instruction. He never asked him a question. And then he wrote 62 uses of ekklesia into the founding documents of the institution that claims to speak for Jesus. Now pay attention to the dates. Paul's letters, the letters in which episkopos, diakonos, and presbyteros first appear as institutional roles in a community organized around Jesus' teachings, were written in the 50s and early 60s of the 1st century CE. Matthew's Gospel, the text that contains all 3 uses of ekklesia in Jesus' speech, and the only text that contains Matthew 16 verse 18, was written approximately 80 to 90 CE. Paul's institutional vocabulary was in circulation for 20 to 30 years before Matthew finalized the text that records Jesus using the word church. The governance structure came before the founding document. The bureaucracy preceded its own authorization. I walked around the block twice when I worked out the dates clearly. A history teacher by training notices sequences. The sequence matters. There was a moment. You know the one. I am not speculating. I am not asking about something hypothetical. You know the specific moment when the institution put itself between you and whatever you were reaching toward. Maybe it was communion. Maybe you walked up the aisle and the cup was not offered because of a divorce or a remarriage or something about your situation that the institution had categorized as disqualifying. You stood there in the line, in front of the altar, and the priest looked at you and the access was denied. By a man with an office, maybe it was a death. Someone in your family died, someone who hadn't been baptized or who had left the church, or whose life had put them in the wrong column of the institution's ledger, and someone told you with certainty, with the confidence of institutional authority, where that left them. Told you as though the organization had jurisdiction over that question. Maybe it was smaller than that. Maybe you were a child and you asked a question. A real question, a precise question, the kind that comes from genuinely wanting to understand. And the teacher, or the priest, or the person standing at the front of the room showed you the expression that said, "That question does not get answered here." And you understood. You understood that there were questions you could ask and questions you could not, that the institution had a perimeter, and you had just found it. In any of those moments, in all of them, the institution performed its central function. It stood in the space between you and God. It said, "Access runs through us. I am asking you to do one thing. Find the verse where Jesus authorized that. Find the sentence in the 4 canonical Gospels, in Jesus' own recorded speech, where he says that a building with a registered address and a governance structure derived from a man who never met him gets to decide who receives grace and who does not. Find the passage where he says a succession of men holding titles Paul invented has jurisdiction over whether you can reach what you are reaching toward. Find it in Mark. Find it in Luke. Find it in John. Find it in Matthew in the 61 chapters that are not chapter 16, verse 18. Take all the time you need. That's it. That's the question. Now let me bring in J.J. Benitez, because his engagement with this specific problem, who built the institutional church and whether Jesus authorized what was built, is the most direct intervention in his body of work on the subject. I want to be precise about what his work is and what it isn't. Benitez is not a peer-reviewed New Testament scholar. His methodology in Caballo de Troya, the 10-volume series in which time-traveling American pilots serve as first-century historical observers, operates outside the verification standards that Bart Ehrman or Elaine Pagels would apply. If you asked Ehrman to evaluate Caballo de Troya by the criteria of historical Jesus scholarship, he would want considerably more before treating the reconstructed accounts as evidence. I hold Benitez's work at the level Ehrman would hold it. What I find valuable in him is not the time travel framework. It is the question he has been asking for 40 years with the methodological discipline of a professional investigator. Benitez raises the single-source problem for Matthew 16, verse 18 directly and repeatedly across the Caballo de Troya series. He notes what textual scholars also note. Mark, written first, does not contain it. Luke, written independently, does not contain it. John, working from a different source tradition entirely, does not contain it. And he asks, across multiple volumes and in public interviews spanning 4 decades, whether the founding charter of the papacy emerged from an actual utterance by Jesus, or from the moment when, in his phrasing preserved in the scholarly documentation of his work, the teachings of the rabbi had begun to be analyzed within bureaucratic collegial structures that required justification for their own existence. That is a precise framing. It is textually grounded. It does not require accepting the time travel methodology. It requires only accepting that 3 evangelists who produced full accounts of Jesus' ministry did not include the sentence on which the papacy rests. Benitez's broader claim in the series, documented across the volumes in the direct dialogue the narrator records with Jesus, is that Jesus consistently and specifically disavows the institutional framework that would later be built around his name. Not incidentally, consistently. The word Benitez uses in the original Spanish is telling, gradualmente, gradually, as if the disavowal were not a single dramatic statement, but a pattern across many encounters, a persistent thread running through everything the narrator observes. The Jesus of Caballo de Troya does not found a church. He describes something the institution cannot contain. And the 3 numbers in my notebook, Jesus 3, Paul 62, Matthew 1 of 4, are not Benitez's argument. They are in your concordance. They have been there since before Benitez was born. Here is the document I want to hand you that almost nobody mentions in this conversation. The Didache, from the Greek word for teaching, also called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. The Didache is the oldest surviving community manual in Christian history. The earliest guide to communal life in the movement that gathered around Jesus' teachings. Scholars date it to approximately 95 to 110 CE. Some argue for an earlier core, possibly as early as the 60s or 70s CE for its foundational sections. The textual discussion continues, but even the conservative end of the scholarly consensus places the Didache within 60 to 70 years of the crucifixion, within living memory of the generation that was alive when it happened. This is not a medieval document. This is not a later reconstruction. This is an early Christian community writing down for its own use how to live as followers of Jesus. And here is what the didact does not contain: bishops, priests, fixed liturgy, apostolic succession, jurisdictional hierarchy with titles descending from a center. The Eucharist, the practice the Catholic Church considers its central act of worship, the ritual around which the entire institutional apparatus of priesthood and ordination is organized, could be celebrated in any home, by a traveling prophet, without a priest, without an altar, without a building. The didact's instructions for receiving prophets are specific and practical. If a prophet arrives and asks to stay more than 2 or 3 days, be cautious. If one asks for money, they are a false prophet. If one calls for a table to be prepared in the Spirit and then eats from it themselves, they are a false prophet. These are the instructions of a living, mobile, decentralized movement spread across a region. No headquarters, no permanent address, no registered authority with the power to certify who could perform what ritual and who could not. This is the community of Jesus' followers 60 to 70 years after his death. They were not structured around an institution because the institution had not yet arrived. The bishops and priests and fixed liturgy and succession of authority came later, significantly later. Paul's institutional vocabulary was already old by the time the didact was written, and even so, the community the didact describes had not yet absorbed it. The didact tells you what the movement actually looked like before the institution arrived, and claimed to have been there from the beginning. It looked like nothing the institution would recognize as itself. Because it wasn't. The institution came after. Someone built it, and the someone was not Jesus. Matthew 6 verse 6 is still in the book. It was never taken out. It is in every Bible, every translation, every edition, every language the canonical Gospels have ever been rendered into. Go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father in secret. A room, a closed door. No address, no appointment, no membership fee, no credential required at the entrance, no ecclesiastical category that determines your standing, no priest to verify that your life meets the qualifications. A room, a closed door, and the Father who is in secret is already there. That is the sentence. That is what Jesus said when someone asked him how to pray. Not build a structure, not establish a hierarchy with bishops and deacons and a succession of authority running from a designated rock. Not find the institution with the correct architectural floor plan and the properly ordained ministers and the authorized liturgy. A room, a closed door. That sentence is the structural and organizational opposite of every cathedral ever built. Not by loose analogy, not as a spiritual metaphor that can be set aside when you need to think about the actual buildings. Literally opposite. The cathedral says, "Come to us, through us, according to our access structure." Matthew 6 verse 6 says, "Close the door." The cathedral says, "You need the right credentials and the correct institutional standing." Matthew 6 verse 6 says, "The Father who is in secret is already in the room." The cathedral says, "We mediate between you and the divine." Matthew 6 verse 6 says, "There is no mediation required." The sentence was never censored, it was never buried, never placed on a list of texts to be destroyed, never excluded from a council's canonical decisions. It was simply never taken seriously as an architectural instruction, because the institution that controlled the translation and interpretation of the text had decided it was a spiritual metaphor, not a specification. But it reads like a specification. It is as specific as a building code. A room, a closed door, a presence that was never gated. That is the church Jesus described. Not the building on the Roman courtroom floor plan. Not the institution with the governance vocabulary from a man who never met him. Not the hierarchy whose founding document appears in one gospel and is absent from the 3 written before or alongside it. The room, the closed door. The Father already in the room, already present, already available, before the building was built and after the building is gone. You have always had access to that room. Nobody needed to construct anything for you to enter it. Nobody needed to write an institutional charter. Nobody needed to consecrate anyone or establish a succession of authority or design a floor plan that makes you feel like a petitioner walking toward a distant magistrate. The room was always there. The door was always closable. The Father in secret was never gated. That is the only church Jesus described. You were already in it. You always were. This is Nathan, Forbidden Gospels, 3 numbers in a concordance. Jesus, 3. Paul, 62. Matthew, 1 of 4 Gospels. The room is still there. The door still closes.